Hello, I'm Commissioner Ben Hovland with the United States Election Assistance Commission. Earlier this year, the President issued an executive order on promoting access to voting. As part of that order, the EAC is supporting a variety of federal agencies as they gather information and develop strategies to improve voter access. Today's conversation will focus on the barriers voters with disabilities face in voting absentee or by mail, and strategies to overcome those challenges. Collecting and sharing best practices for accessible voting is an important part of the EAC's work, and we're happy to contribute to this effort. Today I'm speaking with Clark Rachfal, Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs for the American Council of the Blind, Brett Harbage, ADA Coordinator for the Office of Ohio Secretary of State, Susan Lapsley, the California Assistant Secretary of State, and Help America Vote Act State Director, as well as for the Council and the Secretary of State. And Reina Miller, the California Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee Coordinator. And finally, last and certainly not least, the Honorable Kim Wyman, Washington Secretary of State. Thank you all for being here today for this important discussion. And really to kick things off, I'll go around the whole panel, and to start the discussion, if you could describe some feedback that you've received on challenges and successes of voters with disabilities when it comes to voting by mail or absentee voting. We'll kick off with Secretary Wyman. We'll give you first honor, Secretary, and then go from there.
Oh, well, thank you, Commissioner. Here in Washington State, we have certainly been looking at the challenges for people in the disability community in our state for a couple of decades. And of course, it came out of the Help America Vote Act in earnest when each county and the state created disability advisory committees. And these committees have just made a tremendous difference in our state, as I'm sure they have across the country, in identifying problems. I think for us, some of them are simple solutions. For example, with a vote by mail system like we have here in this state, printing guidelines that are tactile. So a person who is low vision or visually impaired can actually feel where they can align it on the a box on the envelope so they know where to sign it. Or, working with our committees again to use vendors and some of the technology tools that they've developed to allow a person to use their own technology at their home to be able to mark a ballot, print it out, and submit it by mail. So I think really for us, the biggest lessons we've learned is communicating with those in the community to give us feedback on ways we can solve these problems.
Thank you, Secretary. And I know for those of you at home or watching this, that may not be the same order, but Clark, do you want to go ahead and go next?
Thank you so much, Commissioner. So as the Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs for the American Council of the Blind, we are a nationwide member-driven organization, including our state affiliates and local chapters throughout the country. And voting has certainly been top of mind for our members, not only since the passage of HAVA well before, but most recently with the pandemic. Transportation access, information access broadly were significant barriers for people with disabilities, including those with vision loss, and certainly access to the polls as well. So specifically to absentee and remote voting. The main barrier that has persisted for our members in the broader community are the inaccessibility of paper ballots. Whether folks are unable to read the print on paper ballots, don't have the mobility or dexterity to handle, fold, and mail the paper ballot. So what's changed over the past few years? I think we've seen a lot more engagement, such as the folks on this panel will highlight, and that we just heard about was being done in the state of Washington. We're getting a lot more feedback and inclusion in conversations on how to make voting more accessible, not only in the polling location, but also for remote absentee voting. The greatest innovations that we've heard about from our members and that has the most excitement and potential to increase access is allowing for electronic delivery, completion, and return of the ballot, so that we eliminate that transportation barrier, we eliminate the inaccessibility of the voter needing to handle the inaccessible paper ballot, and we can allow the voter to use assistive technology to, again, receive, complete, and return the ballot so that it can then be printed and counted like all other ballots.
Thank you. We'll go to the great state of California. Susan, if you could kick off, and then Reina, if you want to follow, again, just talking about some of the challenges and successes that you've seen and heard from voters with disabilities when it comes to mail-in absentee voting.
Yeah, Reina will give you the much more comprehensive view, as she has far more knowledge than I do. For us, it's very similar to what Secretary Wyman is, as well as Clark. Our huge for us has been our VAC. It's our Voting Accessibility Advisory Commission. We've had a VAC, oh gosh, since the implementation of HAVA, and we've really worked with the counties to ensure that they have VACs, because having that partnership with the accessibility community is huge. Our VAC provides feedback and input on initiatives, on documents, on all kinds of items relating to accessibility. I think for us, also our partnership with the Disability Rights of California, it's an organization within California, has been key. They've helped us through lots of different issues, as well as been subject matter experts for us, help bring issues to the forefront that maybe we would not have heard about or fully understood and been able to wrap our arms around. I think that partnership has been key to, as we move forward with changing the way we vote in California. There's obviously COVID impacted everyone, but in California, we've also been moving towards more and more vote by mail, as well as a vote center model, which has early voting, and anyone can vote in anywhere within their county. And that is a transition for California. Many states have had it and they're used to it, but it's a transition for California. So DRC, Disability Rights of California, has been key to making sure that we do it successfully and with accessibility in mind. I'd say the other two things for us that have been successes have been, we do surveys after every election for our disability community and accessibility community. We, and Reina can fill in, but we have anywhere from 200 to 300 people after every election that fill out these surveys. They're statewide. And we talk about the successes, we talk about the challenges, and it's a baseline survey. So year to year and election to election, we can see if there's changes or if there's issues. And I think that's been very helpful as well. And then I'd say the last thing has been our partnership with our disability, our disability Department of Rehabilitation. Sorry, it's early this morning. They have assisted us with surveying polling places for accessibility. They've also been partners as we move to remote accessible vote by mail. It's a mouthful here in California, RAVBM, remote accessible vote by mail, which Clark and Kim also talked about, and been, again, real partners and advocates, and helped us ensure that the remote accessible vote by mail implementation was done successfully and the right way and accessibly. So I'd say that's the big things for us. Reina, anything I missed or that you'd add?
Reina, I believe you're muted. I don't know if you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. No, Susan covered most of it. I did want to just maybe add on a few of our challenges. We have a lot of successes. 2020, from the survey, a lot of people were happy, and even we did an after debrief with Disability Rights of California, and they had people from the public joining that as well. And I feel like that is very important so that they feel that they're heard, but also that we hear things that we might just not hear of even in our back meetings. So the debriefs are always very helpful, I believe. And, that's where, what can we improve? A lot of people, even though they were very happy, there's always things that we can do better. So, like Kim and Clark mentioned earlier, voting by mail, although they enjoyed having that extra time to review the ballot and kind of pick who can assist them with filling out the ballot, it's still not as accessible as it could be for everyone. RAVBM for us, it was great. A lot of people enjoy it, but unfortunately here in California, you can't return it via internet. So things like that they mentioned are some of the challenges that I can think of. But other than that, everyone seemed very happy with the 2020 election. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Brett, I probably should have let you go first as a courtesy to the early nature that it is for our West Coast panelists, but I've still got some bitterness about some losses to Ohio State. So,
so that's why I get to go last, huh?
We'll make up for it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here, and would love to hear about your experience in Ohio.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on, Commissioner. I've been the ADA coordinator here 14, going on almost 15 years now. So I get the opportunity to actually work with the disability community here in Ohio. So, I get feedback from them and some of the, successes that we have had with voting by mail and absentee voting. We have multiple options for voters with disabilities to exercise their right here in Ohio. We have an accessible absentee voting system. We have early in-person voting. We also have absentee by mail. And these are all options that people with disabilities can take advantage of. And I think some of the things that people with disabilities like about those options, they're just the convenience of being able to vote at home. That's a great option for people with disabilities. They can get the assistance they need from a family member or a friend. Having, I think Clark mentioned the barriers of transportation in the disability community. So that eliminates having to travel on election day. So that's a good thing for people with disabilities. We also have multiple options for returning ballots, including use of mail. We also have drop boxes that people can go to their board of elections. They don't even have to get out of their vehicle. They can drop those ballots off at their board of elections. So that's convenient for voters with disabilities. So I think there's a lot of benefits for people with disability when it comes to absentee voting and also voting by mail here in Ohio. So.
Great, thank you. And EAC partnered with Rutgers University to do a survey earlier this year where we learned a lot about the experience of voting for Americans with disabilities across the country. It was some great survey work done by Professors Schur and Cruz at Rutgers. And in that, we were able to see that, election officials around the country have absolutely been improving the service to voters with disabilities. You can see big jumps in the experience from 2012 to 2020. We also were able to see in that survey data that the options for Americans to vote made a big difference. Again, there were many more Americans who identified as having a disability were able to vote without difficulty, but there was still room to go. And in particular, we saw a number of Americans saying that mail and absentee options helped them vote. But as was highlighted before, by Clark, was there are still some folks who have challenges with that, and as we strive to allow every American to vote independently and privately, I think one of those things that we hit on a second ago, but would love to go back to for anything that didn't get mentioned was just some of those effective strategies and techniques or technologies that people have used or implemented to address some of these barriers with mail and absentee. Brett, I'll let you go first this time. Maybe we'll go in reverse order for this one.
Okay, great. So some of the technologies here in Ohio, in 2018, we implemented our accessible absentee voting systems. There's 5 different vendors in the state that provide those systems. Utilizing a safe and secure ballot delivery option that allows a voter with disability to receive an absentee ballot in an accessible format. So, that's important. So they do have to be connected to the internet because they receive that. They do receive an email with a link to their ballot on a secure site, where the voter logs in, completes, and prints their ballot. At that point, when the voter receives that email, they can access, read, and mark their ballot. Obviously, there's a fine line between accessibility and making those safe and secure. We understand that. But the important thing about that process is making sure that a voter with a disability can vote privately and independently. That's the most important thing. They can exercise their right through that accessible absentee voting system. These systems allow the voter with a disability to use assistive technology, whether it's a screen reader or some other assistive technology they have on their computer. So that's vitally important to somebody marking their ballot independently. And then after the ballot is marked, here in Ohio, you must print your ballot and return it to your Board of Elections in a hard copy format. Electronic delivery is not allowed. It's prohibited in the state of Ohio. But we think that this is the best option. Again, there's a fine line between making things accessible, but also making them safe and secure in a manner. And we think it's important that people with disabilities are returning their ballot just like anybody else. If a person's getting a ballot in the mail, they have to return that ballot in the mail. So we think that's important. So.
Great, thank you. We'll go to California. Susan and Reina, I'll let you all figure out how you want to take this on for what the work that you've been doing in California and any of the techniques or technologies that you've implemented. And again, I know you hit a little bit of this earlier, but if you want to expand on that or highlight anything else.
Yeah, again, Reina, you can jump in at any time if I mess anything up. I think probably the most effective is, just like Brett had mentioned, was the RAVBM, Remote Accessible Vote by Mail system. And our system is set up very much like Brett's, as Reina had discussed. It is a individual with disabilities or anyone who would like to access the RAVBM receives an email, and they can use their own assistive devices at home. It makes it easier versus going into a polling place where you're having to use, SIP and Puff and the other the ATIs that are within the polling place that a person may not be familiar with, or it may not cover their needs. So being able to use an individual's own assistive devices within the comfort of their home to have their same time that they'd have a much longer time period than they would going into a polling place is key. But for us, it's the same thing, that balance between security and accessibility. Right now in California, as Reina had mentioned, the RAVBMs cannot be returned electronically. It has to be print, signed, and mailed. I'd say for us, in implementing that over the last couple of election cycles, some of the challenges have been the communication of it, letting people know that it's available, right, first and foremost, and that's where those partnerships have come in, but also to get it to a wider audience where sometimes our partnerships may not be hitting. Also helping people understand what it is and what it isn't, right? Lots of people thought that it was internet voting, we all understand how voting systems work and voting works, but the average person really doesn't. It's much more complicated than people think. So right off the bat, a lot of people thought it was internet voting. So making sure that people understood what it is and what it isn't. And then, as Brett said, having the options, the flexible options for people to be able to return that that vote by mail ballot, whether it be drop boxes or convenient locations that are close to public transportation, easy to get to, and then obviously accessible, right? It doesn't make any sense to have something that is maybe easy to get to on a map and location wise, but if there's barriers to getting to it, then it doesn't do anyone any good. So ensuring that those locations, not just our polling places, but our drop boxes, are accessible to everyone, it has been key. We also have offered, and I know this is a little bit different, but curbside voting. I know that it's been that you had wanted to focus on vote by mail, but curbside voting has been huge for us over the last few years. And what that is an individual comes up, and especially during COVID too, and they and counties have a variety of different ways of having their voters notify them that they're the poll workers, that they're there. And the poll workers go out to the voter and they assist the voter at their car and help ensure that they're able to cast their ballot there with the assistance of the poll worker to be able to answer questions, to help with language needs, to help with accessibility, to just be able to provide that service to them as a customer, as a voter, has been key. Reina, did I miss anything?
No, and I just wanted to add on that with RAVBM, since everyone is receiving an envelope, they don't have to worry about that portion of, do I have an envelope to return the RAVBM? It's not a ballot, right? I'm forgetting the term, but that's elections. So I think everyone receiving a vote by mail envelope really assists that. And with counties, some counties have implemented having hole punch on the envelope to assist with voters who are legally blind or impaired to know where to sign the envelope. So I feel like that has been a huge help as well. And, you know, a lot of people don't like, that is like Susan is saying, where organizations help with letting people know, like, hey, you could use your envelope. You don't have to worry about going and finding one. So I feel like that's another feedback that we received that's been very helpful for them.
I just would add that 2018 was the first year that we implemented RAVBM during that election cycle, and we had in the full election cycle we had about a little under 1,000 voters who used it. Obviously, we learned from that. We refined messaging. We implemented more outreach and communication to be able to let voters know about it. And in the 2020 election cycle, we saw just under 60,000 users. So keep that, the context of that, California has over 22 million voters, right? So the context of that is, it's still a very small number, but as we refine and make sure that voters know and understand what it is, and how to use it, those numbers grow and people's comfort level becomes higher.
Great, thank you. Secretary Wyman.
Oh, wait a second. I figured Clark was next. Okay.
I thought I'd go through the administrators and then let Clark round out a 50 state.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, you know, I think very similar threads here in Washington to what we're hearing in our counterparts in Ohio and California. I think the theme of our counties and the Secretary of State's office is really meeting the voters where they are and working closely with groups like Disability Rights Washington, who has been invaluable in our development of our system. But having them attend conferences and do presentations and put, you know, some of the issues that are challenges for different segments of the disability community front and center. And, you know, simple things like making sure that you can get from the bus to the voting center in a wheelchair, and actually, you know, doing video and showing some of our sites and putting it front and center for election officials that, yeah, this might be easy for you, but this is really difficult for me, and changing that kind of paradigm. I think that we're doing a lot of things creatively in each community that's unique to the needs of the community. For example, our county auditors work really closely to bring equipment to people in their homes that they need it, and certainly COVID presented challenges on that front. But going to, say, a nursing home and bringing the equipment there so that they can use a device to mark their ballot, or, as I said, using low-tech solutions to help voters be able to adapt their home situation and use their own technology. Finally, you know, kind of using that technology to our advantage. So we have a pretty robust outreach program for our voters, including a state voters pamphlet that goes to every home. In the general election, our counties do voters pamphlets, and providing translation services for those, not only in other languages, but Braille translation, and having audio formats available that voters can use. And those are also ways for us to provide education and outreach to what those options are for voters to be able to mark their ballot. And then finally, using our technology of our 4 vendors with our ballot systems to be able to at least send a voter a ballot in an electronic format that they can use on their assistive device to be able to mark and print the ballot. Like you're hearing in other states, the challenge is the return. That mostly is a security issue. We're right now in Washington, only military overseas voters can return a ballot electronically, and even that my techs are not comfortable with. So we're rethinking that and working with the legislature to find other solutions. So we're looking forward to working with NIST to come up with solutions and standards for companies so that voters can have assurance that their ballot is returned as they marked it.
Thank you for that, Secretary. And Clark, as I mentioned, come to you last to sort of think about this from that 50-state perspective. Obviously, at the American Council of the Blind, you know, you all hear a decent amount about this, and I think we've hit on some interesting pieces here about, you know, obviously that balance of security and accessibility is always an issue, and particularly when it comes to things like electronic return. You know, that's complicated by the secrecy of the ballot and the whole, you know, a big part of making sure that people can vote independently and privately is also ensuring that secrecy. And so, you know, like almost everything in elections, it varies across the country. Undoubtedly, you know, you've heard about a lot of different ways that administrators have tried to assist their voters around the country. And I don't know if you could highlight any of the things that you've heard about that are working better, or some of these technologies that are helping voters. And I think it ranges from high tech to low tech. I think what Reina said a second ago about the envelopes that have the hole punches in them, you know, again, obviously that helps a lot of Americans know where to sign, know how to use that envelope. And so I think would just be interested in anything that you've heard about to really highlight some of the ways that are working better to assist voters.
Sure, and I certainly want to first applaud the work of my fellow panelists that they're doing in their states and echo several of the points that they made. You know, having an accessible election and doing everything possible to increase the rate of voter participation, it really helps to have that kind of that cheesecake factory menu of available voting options, right? You know, accessible elections for the general public as well as people with disabilities. There's no one size fits all solution. So as much as possible, as Secretary Wyman said and Brett said, being able to meet people where they are and have a variety of available options for voters with disabilities. You know, not many voters who are blind and visually impaired are taking advantage of curbside voting. That doesn't mean that it's not an important option for the tens of thousands or more voters who are able to take advantage of that service. And then, oh, by the way, by doing that, you free up the other options available to other voters. So certainly support the all of the above approach to provide folks accessible voting options that meet their needs. If I could just share my personal experience with vote by mail. I'm a resident of Virginia currently and voted in the Virginia presidential primary with a vote by mail paper ballot. The entire process I needed to complete with the assistance of my wife. Not that I wanted assistance. You know, it's fine if somebody wants assistance to complete their ballot, but I had no choice if I wanted to use remote voting. Fast forward to the general election, fall of 2020, and I was able to request and receive my ballot electronically, complete my ballot electronically, super easy, accessible, convenient. And then this is where the story gets good. So like many Americans, I don't have a printer. So I then had to take my completed ballot over to a friend's apartment in the middle of the pandemic, stand on the sidewalk outside of his apartment, connect to his Wi-Fi, and print wirelessly via his printer. He then brought the ballot out to me, where then I needed my wife's assistance, again, to fill out the envelope and then drive to a drop box. So that doesn't sound very private or independent, right? So I think that there's still a lot that of ways that we can improve these systems. I'd like to commend the EAC commissioner for the work that you all did, putting out guidance related to the available funding to states for the CARES Act and how that could be used to increase accessibility in remote voting, as well as supporting the Rutgers survey, where we did see that there are improvements in voting accessibility, but for voters with cognitive and visual impairments, it ranged from 20 to 30% of voters who still said that they experienced difficulties. And then I believe it was 17% of voters said that they encountered significant barriers for accessible voting. So we know that there's still work to be done. To echo Brett again, people with disabilities should have the same access to voting as all other citizens. And I think where we're starting to see the most movement in this space in terms of our members nationwide and the disability community nationwide is greater access to absentee voting methods that are available to other voters, including uniformed military and overseas voters. So if there are segments of the voting population that are able to receive, mark, and return their ballot electronically, and in many states, UOCAVA voters have been able to receive, mark, and return their ballots by fax, by email, electronically for several years now. We're seeing states open those systems up to voters with disabilities as well. And as Susan said in California about what that's done for voter participation, having access and it going from 10,000 voters participating to 60,000, they're not doing the electronic return for voters with disabilities in California, but it is interesting that UOCAVA voters have the option of fax return. And then as Secretary Wyman said in Washington, the UOCAVA voters being able to return their ballots via fax or email. I'd also like to highlight the work being done in King County in Washington, where allowing electronic return for some of their local elections has more than doubled voter participation over the past couple years. And when it comes to security, voters with disabilities, we don't want our votes to be any less secure than anyone else's. But if elections are inaccessible, we know that that's a lost opportunity and that's a lost vote that's not counted. So if there are options and if other voters have available options for using technology to make voting more accessible, those systems must be available to voters with disabilities as well.
Thanks for that, Clark. Susan, did you?
I actually, if you don't mind, sorry.
Yeah.
Clark, I'd like to say thank you for that feedback and that perspective. I think that I know as election officials in California, that's the piece that that we have really tried to work with our partners on, and hearing that type of experience, people don't think about all those steps that you just had to go through, right? And it's nascent technology still, the RAVBMs, whatever you call them, the remote accessible voting, vote by mail is still nascent technology, and election officials are still trying to wrap their arms around them and try to make it easier. But hearing, Clark, that kind of feedback, and you walk through the steps and where the system was challenging and didn't allow for you to vote independently and privately is key, right? To make sure people really understand what your experience was, because most people don't see past the, oh, here you're in your home and you marked your ballot, done. So I think that's super helpful, and I think advocates from disability rights and others keep sounding that and helping people understand what the process is. And then I really like your Cheesecake Factory analysis, because while RAVBM works for you, I mean, not perfectly, right? But it's good for you and lots of other 60,000 Californians. It's not for everyone. My own personal experiences, he passed away last year, but my uncle had cerebral palsy, passed away at the age of 85, was a very consistent voter, and going to the polls was important for him. And RAVBM was beyond his comfort zone and where he'd want to go. And so having the panoply of options for people and being able to meet the voter where they're at and their comfort level, I think is key. So thanks for that perspective, Clark.
Absolutely. And I think that really does tee up sort of the next piece that I'd want to talk about. And Clark, I'll let you kick us off on that. But, again, hearing your story, your experience, I mean, I think that, it reinforces, again, we know we've made progress, and that's great. That's hugely important, but we know there are still gaps out there, and there's still work to be done. And so I think, as you highlighted some of those, but those gaps that remain, and sort of what resources are needed to fill those, how do we continue to move forward to serve voters?
Great, thank you. I guess first I'd start with election information, right? So again, kudos to the EAC for the accessible voter information, including Braille voting cards that you all make available. I'll never miss an opportunity to plug, although the Department of Justice has not promulgated guidelines or regulations around website accessibility, their position and stance has been clear that the ADA does cover website accessibility. So we need to ensure that election information available on websites is in accessible formats, including information about registration, voting, so that voters can make a plan and they can be prepared. And the more prepared we can be, the more we can have time to review that menu of options. We can become more comfortable with the voting process and more confident in our ability to complete the process accessibly. As the EAC has certification standards in place for in-person voting due to the Help America Vote Act, I really think that's an area that we need to look at for remote accessible voting. And yes, currently that's outside the EAC scope, but it's an important area for Congress to look at, because we do want, as Susan said, this nascent technology, although it's been around for a decade now, I think it would create more comfort in the minds of election officials and government so that we can have accessible, secure electronic voting options that have been tested and certified, available to our election officials, so that voters can have, again, more options that are accessible, available to them.
Great, I appreciate that. Brett, you want to go next? You are muted, I believe.
Yeah, going back just a little bit, I wanted to mention, we have all those options in Ohio for voting, and a lot of the panelists have been mentioning that. One thing that we did, and I think maybe we were the only Secretary of State's office in the country maybe that allotted some of our HAVA funding in 2020. We gave county boards of elections a portion of that funding to make improvements at their board offices and also their early voting centers, and that's fiscal accessibility improvements. We hadn't had any money available, I think, for 7 or 8 years. I think that money discontinued in 2014, but it was very, very successful in that, there were still some barriers that needed removed at their county board offices or early vote centers. We're obviously early voting is, important for a lot of people in the state of Ohio. They like to go down early, 30 days before the election. That helps with a lot of different things when we're trying to create accessible elections. But we had 78 out of our 88 county boards of elections utilize that funding and expanded accessibility physically. And also we allotted some of that funding to be used on website accessibility. So we made sure that our sample ballots were accessible. We made sure that our voter lookups were accessible, and the contact forms that are on our county boards of elections websites. So, and I think there'll probably be upwards to just under $1 million that was spent on physical access at county board offices and early vote centers and also websites. So, even though we had that money several years back, there was still a lot of room for improvements. That way people could come down to the board offices and vote early, or some of that money was spent on, making sure drop boxes are accessible, making sure they're placed in a manner where somebody could get out of their vehicle and get to those boxes, and or, drop them off while they're in their vehicle. So, we felt like that was important to make sure that option is accessible to people with disabilities. And then just, mention some, resources and gaps that maybe need filled. What I think and it was mentioned earlier by one of the panelists, that education piece, making people aware that accessible absentee voting is available and how that system works. And then just, Clark's talking about the Cheesecake Factory, making sure that everybody knows what their options are in the state of Ohio to cast a ballot. So I think that's one of the things that, we want to work on here and make sure people are educated. So.
Thank you for that. California, Susan, Reina, do you want to talk at all about some of the gaps that you see and resources that are needed to help address that? Obviously, California has been undergoing a lot of change in the voting process with the Voters' Choice Act, and obviously expedited in some ways with the pandemic. But with that change, I think we always see issues that need to be addressed, resources that we need. So would love to hear about anything that you're seeing in California along those lines.
Yeah, I would echo what Brett said. I think that the 261 funding, which I believe expired in 2017-ish, I think that the specific 261 money that EAC should take a look at, really getting a reallocation of that or a new allocation of that. The money that has come over the last few years has been great, and California has gotten the lion's share of it. But I do think that having it specifically for accessibility is key, right? When you're looking at election administration, there's a lot of areas that need improvement that can be enhanced. When you're looking at cybersecurity, it's expensive, so when you start looking at, you have a pie and all the different pieces are being pulled without that specific allocation for accessibility, my concern is what happens is that it gets, the piece of that pie, of that cheesecake, so to speak, gets smaller and smaller, right? So I think having that 261 money would be huge for states. I know in California, we still do accessibility contracts with our local election officials, with every single one of them, and we take part of our HAVA funds and we allocate them to the counties. For accessibility, it's not a huge amount of money, but it's a regular amount of money that counties can use, and it's everything that Brett had talked about. RAVBM purchase and maintenance, it's the communication, it's the accessibility of websites, it's the accessibility of all their election information. Having that resource to them and their locations is key, and having it be regular, right? Not every 10 years, not every 15 years. I'm a strong advocate, and so is the Secretary in California, Secretary of State of California, that we can't just wait until everything's falling apart or standards have totally changed and then say, oh, now we're going to fix it. We have to have consistent funding to make sure that we maintain accessibility and we maintain security and all those things that we want to do in elections. I know that challenges for us, and Reina, you can jump in here and correct me, but signature verification is still a challenge in the accessibility community. And as we in California have gone to all vote by mail ballots with COVID and into this year, as well as we still are facing the tail end of the pandemic, hopefully, we still have challenges with signature verification. I know that's an ongoing conversation with our accessibility community. But Reina, is there anything else from a gap perspective that you would add?
No, I think everything has been covered with prior conversations as well as we just added. So I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And, Susan, the resource point and the funding piece, I think that you made a couple great points there. I mean, we hear regularly about the need for that consistent funding stream, and obviously we're happy at the AC to distribute any congressional funding that we get. Certainly we pride ourselves on that work when the opportunity presents itself. But I think, and I'm going to come to you, Secretary Wyman, actually as a former local election official, I think one of the things we regularly hear is that at the local level, where in most states you see most of the funding for elections, there's always that challenge of priorities, and does somebody it is used a lot, are people prioritizing buying a new fire truck or new voting equipment? But I think, Susan, you hit on something right there in the cybersecurity conversation. We can't throttle back on that, but I think the importance of dedicated election funds, and then for priorities like accessibility, having that dedicated funding stream that we used to see with the original HAVA dollars, I think is an important highlight. So with that, I'll come to Secretary Wyman on sort of gaps and resources that are needed to fill those.
And the panel has hit on the big concerns I have. And I think when we look back at HAVA now, 21 years later-ish, and the implementation of it, that was my concern in 2003, is it's great that Congress is giving us 2 point, whatever it was, 1 billion or 3.1, whatever that big number was, dollars to absolutely upgrade and infuse our elections in a way we'd never seen before. Unless you give us that ongoing funding, we are going to be right back here in a decade or 15 years. And sure enough, we were. One of the things that I'm really proud of here in Washington was a partnership we had with our counties. And probably my proudest political achievement is I got 40 independently elected officials to agree on something and work on a project over 5 years that resulted in a voter registration and voter registration and election management system called VoteWA. And one of the things that we did in building this out was trying to have the interconnectivity between our 39 counties and my office, but also making sure it was accessible from day one. Making sure that when voters could go into our system to update their registration or register for the first time or get information that was unique to them, that it was absolutely in an accessible format from the beginning, that multiple readers could use that information and translate it so that the end user could read it. And I think it's all of that's driven by resources. So, I think we all have some great ideas and solutions, but if we don't have the money available to actually invest in the technology or the research or the innovation, it's not going to happen. And it has to come not only from each state. Our state legislature just started funding counties fully for their share of election costs. And I think we have to have that broader conversation at the national level of what the federal share is for the elections that local government is running every 2 to 4 years for federal elections. And I think if we could get that stability of funding, then you can see that innovation in those conversations. I also want to circle back to the cybersecurity piece. We can't let that lapse for our voters with disabilities. And I think that this is where I wrestle and have been wrestling for 30 years now as a voter who was disenfranchised when I was overseas serving with my husband when he was in the military. And we didn't get a ballot in time because, the county I lived in, I won't say which one it was, but it might be a large Southern California county. Dean Logan, I'm not calling you out because you weren't the guy then. But we got our ballot a day after the election. So I know firsthand what it feels like to be disenfranchised. But at the same time, we can't sacrifice the security either. So how do we get those standards so that we can have secure transmission systems so voters can return their ballot electronically and be ensured that it's received in the way that they marked it and it wasn't tampered with in transit or en route. So I think that's the next challenge. And certainly in the disability community, we want to spend our time there and want to work with communities across the country to get to that point, because it's inexcusable that people can't vote from their homes secretly and independently. And we've got to get to a point where that can be done.
Thank you for that. And actually, Secretary Wyman, I'll let you kick off our last one here. Obviously, we could talk about all this stuff all day, but want to be respectful of people's time. So to sort of conclude the conversation, I think, sort of in summary, anything that you've seen or done that you would recommend to colleagues around the country or election officials, or we'll let you choose your own adventure here, or things that you'd like to see, the EAC or our federal partners focus more on that would be able to assist Americans with disabilities in accessing mail-in absentee ballots?
I think it's a global concept more than any specific action. I think we have to realize as an election community that we've got incredible diversity in the way voting and registration is delivered to our citizens. We have jurisdictions like LA County that have what ridiculous number of millions of people that live in LA County. And we have jurisdictions that have a couple hundred voters. And I guarantee you that town clerk in Vermont who has a couple hundred voters, their resources and ability to have an early voting period of, say, 20 days is vastly different than Orange County, California, and Neil Kelly being able to have a voting period that's 20 days open and really accessible for their voters. And I think that's the heart of what we need to spend our time and shift our focus to, is that diversity of size and resources across the country, knowing that we have voters living with disabilities in every community across this country. So how do we help that very small jurisdiction in the middle of Ohio have the same success and accessibility as San Francisco County or King County, Washington, and have the same innovation? And I think that, we do a lot of good in trying to share ideas, like things like this panel. And the more we can do that, the better. And I think the EAC is well positioned to be able to share that information and those successes and that innovation in a way that other jurisdictions aren't. So I think we just need to continue these partnerships and these these dialogues, and then get those tools so that the smallest to the biggest counties and local jurisdictions have that ability to be successful.
Thank you for that. And for those of you keeping track, Secretary Wyman made 3 California references, 1 Ohio and 1 Vermont. So we'll go to Team California next. Susan, Reina, any thoughts on just, lessons learned, recommendations for other election officials, or things that I guess things that you'd like to see federal partners working on in this area?
And I'm super impressed because she got every single one of the registrar of voters correct. So she wins the primary. So it must be that monster drink that you're drinking. I think for us, having a VAC is key, both at the state and local level. So you have all different levels of input, and they're in a regular, consistent manner. I think making strong partnerships. Again, I said our partnership with DRC and others has been invaluable. Making those partnerships, keeping those partnerships, and strengthening those partnerships are essential. I think that both at the local and the state level, that all election officials should be taking a look at their contracts with their vendors, with their counties, with whoever they have contracts with and agreements with. Look at those and make sure that I'm wearing my attorney hat right now, sorry. Make sure that there's accessibility pieces in there, that there's standards for accessibility. We have this in our ballot tracking contract. We have it in our, of all things, our RLA contract. We have built that into our contracts and our agreements, and it's essential to set the bars to say, hey, this is what we expect out of you. And I know it's harder for smaller jurisdictions and smaller states, but that really sends a message and makes sure that you have a baseline of accessibility. I'm happy to share our contract language if anyone is interested in it. And then, as I said before, the ongoing funding is essential, whether it's coming from the state or from the local entities or from the federal government. That is essential. So I think those are the big things for us.
Great, thank you for that. We might have lost Brett. So Clark, you're up. I was going to give you the last word. It might still be the last word, or maybe Brett's in a power play to get it for himself. I don't know.
I'll fill Brett's time. So even if he comes back, we're done. Where to begin? The other panelists have made such great points. I'd like to just remind folks, accessibility, like cybersecurity, it's a journey, not a destination. There's no such thing as 100% security. There's no such thing as 100% accessibility. So it is an ongoing journey. We didn't pass HAVA in 2002 and dish out a ton of money and say, okay, wipe our hands of it. We're done. Let's go solve how to get wheelchairs and service animals on airplanes. It's like, no, the work continues. And as our other panelists have said, the funding needs to continue as well to assist our states and localities along this journey. But another area for the EAC to provide leadership here is additional funding and funding for research and development into what new accessible technologies are out there and available. I also love hearing the other panelists talk about including accessibility from day one, because it's always more cost effective when the expectations are clear from the beginning, working with vendors and contractors. The easiest example of this is having a physical structure and there being architectural barriers. It's being able to have the visual of removing stairs to put in a ramp, right? Where it would have just been easier to include accessibility from the beginning and build that ramp once. Accessibility when it comes to information access and technology is the same way. It's always cheaper to do it the first time. And a great way to ensure that accessibility is included by, before day one of implementation is to have it in the design, testing, and development stages, and to like Secretary Wyman and Susan from California said, include people with disabilities in those conversations. The state affiliates and local chapters of the American Council of the Blind, we are a available resource. The protection and advocacy agencies in the states and regions are a resource. Centers for independent living can be a resource to help provide accessibility for all voters. So we can all continue on this journey to make remote voting as accessible and secure as possible.
Well, Clark, I think that is a great note to end on, and appreciate that. And really just all of you for being here for this great conversation. As Clark said, it's a work in progress. Conversations like this help us all get better. We can see the progress in the surveys that Rutgers did, but we also can see there's more work to do. So appreciate all that you're doing. Appreciate you all taking the time for this conversation, and we'll keep doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.